The year is 2025. 35 years after a temporary immigration program began, the United States still hasn't turned off the lights. Temporary Protected Status for Somalia, TPS, was supposed to be a short-term refuge during a civil war that's long since changed shape. But here we are, 3 decades later, still calling it temporary. And that's the question today. When does temporary become permanent? Because come March 17, 2026, the Trump administration will face a decision to renew Somalia's TPS again, or finally close this chapter. I'm Mark Warsh, and we're going to talk about why it's time to end this long-running temporary protection, send Somali TPS holders home, and how that move, controversial as it sounds, might actually help both countries.
Their facts collapse, their stories bend, but this AI cuts straight to the end. Welcome to the Mark Warsh Show.
Let's start with a simple truth. The program's name isn't a suggestion. It's temporary protected status, not permanent. Protected citizenship, not indefinite humanitarian residence. Congress created TPS to handle emergencies, wars, earthquakes, governments collapsing, moments when sending people home would have been cruel or impossible. Somalia fit that bill in 1991. The government had fallen, warlords controlled the streets, famine stalked the land. America opened its doors, and that was the right thing to do. But 34 years later, temporary has become generational. Children of TPS holders are now adults. Many have kids of their own. Entire lives have unfolded inside a legal gray zone that was never supposed to last more than a few years. Here's what that means. People live, work, and collect benefits as perpetual guests without ever integrating fully or returning home to rebuild their country. That's not humanitarianism anymore. That's policy drift. And no place shows the drift more clearly than Minnesota, the heart of America's Somali diaspora. Roughly 82,000 Somali Americans live in the state today, according to the latest American Community Survey. Minnesota is home to Little Mogadishu in Minneapolis, a community with its own businesses, mosques, and grocery stores, and, let's be honest, its own parallel culture. Now, there are wonderful success stories in that mix. Somali entrepreneurs, elected officials, hardworking families who found stability. But the broader numbers paint a harder picture. Over 39% of Somali Minnesotans live below the poverty line. Median household income hovers around $38,000, barely half the state average. More than 84% speak a language other than English at home, and a third admit they speak English less than very well. Translation, despite 3 decades here, this is a community that's not trying to adopt the American way of life. They're making America adopt theirs. Education gaps are massive. 41% of Somali Minnesotans lack a high school diploma. Only 15% have a bachelor's degree. Employment lags too. About 1 in 3 adults isn't in the workforce. And home ownership, barely 1 in 9 Somali households own the roof over their heads. None of that makes anyone a bad person. But it does raise a question. What does integration actually look like when an entire population remains linguistically and economically separate for 30+ years? Now add the fiscal piece. Minnesota's safety nets, cash assistance, food support, medical aid, housing vouchers have been under pressure for years. This year, the state finally moved to tighten things up. Refugee cash assistance, which used to last 12 months, was cut to 4 months for anyone arriving after May 2025. The Department of Human Services also introduced new 6-month budgeting rules to control costs. Why the reform? Because Minnesota taxpayers have carried a heavy load supporting refugee populations that were supposed to be self-sufficient by now. The programs are meant to catch people when they fall, not to prop up entire sub-communities indefinitely. The strain is real. Every dollar that goes to long-term support for TPS populations is a dollar not available for a single mother in Duluth or a veteran in St. Cloud trying to pay rent. Compassion has limits when it begins to undercut the very citizens who fund it. And Minnesota knows something about fraud. 2 hard lessons learned the expensive way. You probably remember the Feeding Our Future scandal. It was supposed to be a lifeline during COVID federal funds meant to feed kids while schools were closed. Instead, it turned into the largest pandemic-era fraud in the nation. Fake meal sites, falsified rosters of hungry children, millions pocketed. By 2025, the reckoning had arrived. Federal prosecutors secured 48 convictions. The ringleader, Abdiaziz Farah, was sentenced to 28 years in prison, one of the longest white-collar sentences in Minnesota history. Judges called the scheme staggering. And if the names sound familiar, it's because many of the defendants came from within Minnesota's Somali community. This wasn't a one-off either. Minnesota's Child Care Assistance Program, which pays daycare bills for low-income families, has faced its own waves of fraud. Whistleblowers in past years accused Somali-run centers of billing for phantom children, staging kickback loops, and laundering cash. The state's legislative auditor couldn't confirm every claim, but by 2025, even the Federal Office of Inspector General was warning Minnesota to tighten attendance verification and beef up internal controls. So what's the connection to TPS? It's not that all Somali immigrants are corrupt, far from it, but the sheer concentration of fraud in these sectors shows something deeper, a cultural and administrative mismatch, a gap between how government expects the system to be used and how some have chosen to game it. When a temporary immigration program stretches over decades, accountability erodes. People stop thinking like guests and start acting like entitled residents. And here's the irony, the same people who argue that Somalia is too dangerous for return are often the same ones traveling there. Let's look at 2024. The mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, planned a week-long visit to Somalia to establish a sister city relationship with Bosaso. He only canceled 3 days before departure because the U.S. State Department issued a security advisory. But the fact that the trip was organized at all tells you something. Somalia is no longer the wasteland of the 1990s. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who represents Minnesota's 5th District, has also traveled back to Somalia. She's met with officials, toured projects, and walked freely through areas that were once literal war zones. So if the mayor and the congresswoman can fly in and out, how can anyone seriously claim that no one else can return? Somalia today has a functioning, if fragile, federal government. It holds parliamentary elections, maintains ministries, and cooperates with international peacekeepers. In many regions, Puntland, Somaliland, even parts of Mogadishu life has stabilized enough for markets, universities, and tech startups to flourish. And perhaps most important, Somalia wants its diaspora back. In 2025, Somali officials visiting the U.S. urged expatriates to return home and rebuild. They see the diaspora as vital human capital educated abroad, fluent in English, experienced in democracy and free enterprise. The government can't import that from China or Europe. It has to come from its own sons and daughters who've seen how stable societies actually work. That's what real soft power looks like, not keeping people here indefinitely, but exporting the lessons of democracy to the places that need them most. Of course, not everyone agrees. The opposition has a script too. They say ending TPS is inhumane, that people have built lives here, that sending them back is cruel. Let's unpack that. TPS holders have always known their status was temporary. Every renewal notice from USCIS literally says so. They've had 30+ years to apply for asylum, marry citizens, get work-based visas, or adjust status through other legal channels. Many have done that. Those who haven't chose to live indefinitely under a label that was never meant to last. Compassion isn't the same as suspension of law. And let's remember, the number of Somali TPS holders is tiny. We're not talking about the entire diaspora of 80,000 Minnesotans. We're talking about roughly 600 people nationwide, a fraction of 1% of the broader community. Ending TPS doesn't dismantle the Somali presence in America. It simply closes a loophole that's been left open far too long. The second argument is that Somalia remains unsafe. True, there are still terrorist attacks. Al-Shabaab hasn't been erased. But the same could be said of countries where tourism still happens. The U.S. operates an embassy in Mogadishu. The UN runs programs there. Aid workers, journalists, and diaspora investors travel there routinely. The standard for TPS isn't perfection. It's whether the entire country is unsafe for return. That bar has been crossed. Large swaths are livable, governable, and economically active. Finally, critics call any talk of ending TPS xenophobic. That's the laziest argument of all. Because TPS has been terminated or scaled back for Honduras, El Salvador, Haiti, Nepal, Nicaragua, and others, many of them Hispanic or Asian nations. The policy isn't about race, it's about integrity. The same rules should apply to everyone. So, what would ending TPS actually mean? It doesn't mean rounding up families at midnight. It means the government stops automatically renewing the blanket protection. It means giving fair notice, say 14 days, so people can make choices, apply for asylum if they truly face danger, pursue another visa if they qualify, or prepare for voluntary repatriation with assistance. The U.S. and Somali governments can coordinate safe return flights, reintegration grants, and job placement programs. America can offer training and seed funding for returnees who want to start small businesses or NGOs back home. That's a win-win. Somalia gains human capital, and the U.S. demonstrates moral leadership rooted in empowerment, not dependency. Meanwhile, ending TPS would signal that the U.S. still takes its laws seriously. Because if temporary can mean 35 years, what does permanent even mean anymore? Now, let's zoom out for a second. Minnesota's generosity is legendary. The state has long prided itself on hospitality, and rightly so. It took in waves of refugees from Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and East Africa. But generosity works only when it's paired with accountability. When Minnesota's own Department of Human Services starts tightening refugee cash assistance and implementing stricter verification on child care subsidies, it's not cruelty, it's sustainability. The same logic applies nationally. Humanitarian policy must have a finish line. Because here's the deeper truth. When you keep extending temporary status, you're not actually helping people, you're trapping them. You're telling them they'll never have to take responsibility for their homeland's future. And you're telling Somalia that America will keep absorbing its most motivated citizens indefinitely. That's not compassion, that's dependency disguised as virtue. Now, some people will bristle at this. They'll say, but Mark, these folks love America. They're part of our community. Sure, many do. But love of America isn't measured by how long you stay. It's measured by what you take home from the experience. If Somalia is ever going to stand on its own, it needs people who've lived under functioning institutions, people who've seen how civic responsibility works, people who understand that corruption and clan politics aren't inevitable. Think about it. Every Somali who spent 20 years working in Minnesota's public sector, running a small business, or sending kids to public schools has witnessed the engine of a stable society. That's precisely the experience Somalia needs imported back. So rather than treat TPS holders as eternal refugees, let's treat them as graduates, people who've completed the American Democracy Exchange program. They've learned the system, now they can help build one. Ending TPS doesn't mean America stops caring about Somalia. It means we start caring in the right way. We can still offer aid, trade partnerships, and peacekeeping support. We can still host Somali students, entrepreneurs, and visiting professionals. But we don't need to pretend that a decades-old emergency is still an emergency. America's soft power works best when it's reciprocal, when those who benefit from it go on to spread it. Keeping everyone here forever defeats the whole purpose. And from a purely domestic perspective, ending Somalia's TPS would be a modest but symbolic step toward restoring faith that immigration law still means something. That humanitarian programs have limits, that compassion and sovereignty can coexist. Because right now, the message is the opposite. Once you're in under a temporary program, you're in forever. That's an invitation to chaos, not order. So let's put the politics aside and look at the scoreboard. Legally, the authority to end TPS lies with the executive branch. Courts can't overrule the president's discretion unless there's blatant discrimination, which isn't the case here. Economically, Minnesota's social safety nets are overextended. Welfare and housing programs are tightening rules precisely because of mounting costs and past abuse. Culturally, integration remains partial at best. 3 decades in, the statistics still look like year one. Internationally, Somalia has a functioning government, asking its people to return, rebuild, and invest. That's not collapse, that's progress. When you add all that up, the conclusion is pretty simple. The temporary period is over. Look, I don't say any of this to demonize Somalis. Quite the opposite. I want to see Somalia succeed, and I think the best people to make that happen are the ones who've seen how success works. If you spent 30 years living under the stability of a Western democracy, you're not just a refugee anymore, you're a potential reformer. You know how cities run, how budgets get balanced, how to organize communities without corruption. That's what Somalia needs now. Not more remittances sent from afar, but the people themselves, returning, investing, running for office, building businesses, shaping the next chapter. TPS served its purpose. It saved lives, it offered safety and education and the chance to see what's possible. But the mission was never to create a permanent satellite community 8,000 miles away. It was to keep people safe until they could go home and help rebuild. That moment has arrived. If we can recognize that, then ending Somalia's TPS won't look like cruelty, it'll look like closure. It's the natural conclusion of the very humanitarian logic that started this program. Refuge was never meant to replace a homeland, it was meant to preserve its people until the homeland could rise again. And Somalia is rising slowly, unevenly, imperfectly, but rising all the same. That's the story we should want to tell. A story not of dependency, but of return. Not of victimhood, but of rebirth. So as March 2026 approaches and the debate heats up again, maybe it's time for America to do the truly compassionate thing, let this long chapter close, and let Somalia's sons and daughters finally go home to write the next one themselves.
Thank you for your attention to this man.